I get eager staring at the Add to Cart button, wondering if a 10-inch subwoofer and a 600-watt amp are really worth the space in your trunk and the extra wiring work. You've probably heard the hype about JBL Club series and the promise of thunder-like bass without draining your battery, but you also know how many car audio upgrades end up as expensive dust collectors. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. So let's walk through what it actually feels like to install the JBL CLUB1000D with its matching CLUB1000D amplifier, and whether that combo makes sense for your ride before you spend a chunk of cash. First off, the biggest decision point for most car audio shoppers is the trade-off between power and practicality. The CLUB1000D Enclosure houses two 10-inch polypropylene drivers that each claim 700W RMS handling. Pair that with a 600W RMS mono amp that's designed to pull minimal current, and you have a system that can put serious punch into a mid-size sedan or a full-size SUV. In theory, that sounds perfect for someone who wants to feel the bass in their chest while cruising down the highway. In practice, the real question is how often you'll actually need that kind of output and whether your car's electrical system can handle it without hiccups. Installation is where the rubber meets the road. The Slipstream port technology built into the enclosure is meant to smooth out the airflow in the port, which reduces the chuffing and distortion you hear when the sub hits its peak. I've seen a lot of port-tuned boxes that sound great at low volumes but start to scream at higher levels, and that's usually because the port design isn't optimized. JBL's approach here seems to mitigate that, so you can crank the bass a little harder before the box starts sounding like a vacuum cleaner. That said, the enclosure is still a fairly sizable unit, roughly a foot wide, a foot tall, and a little over a foot deep. It will take up a noticeable chunk of trunk space, and you'll need to cut a hole for the port if you want the airflow to work as intended. If you're driving a compact hatchback or a small coupe, you'll have to measure twice and think hard about where to stash the sub without sacrificing cargo capacity. The amplifier itself is a mono unit, which simplifies wiring compared to a multi-channel amp, but the 2-ohm load does mean you need a power supply that can comfortably deliver the current. JBL advertises minimal current draw, and in real-world testing that translates to the amp staying cooler than a comparable 4-ohm design during long listening sessions. For most modern cars with a decent alternator, that won't trip a fuse, but if you're running an older vehicle with a marginal charging system, you might see dimming lights or a warning on the dash after a while of heavy bass. The included remote bass control is a nice touch. You can fine-tune the low end from the driver's seat without digging out a phone app, which is handy for quick adjustments when you move from city traffic to open highway. Now, who should actually consider this bundle? If you're a car audio enthusiast who already has a solid head unit and a decent power supply, and you love the idea of feeling every kick of the bass on a road trip or at a tailgate, the CLUB1000D plus a 6001A combo gives you a lot of bang for the buck. The power handling is generous enough that you can pair it with a high-output subwoofer controller or a DSP to sculpt the sound exactly how you like it, and the ported enclosure helps keep the distortion low even when you're pushing the amp hard. It also makes sense for people who have already invested in a larger trunk space like a Subaru Outback or a Chevy Tahoe, because the size of the enclosure won't feel like a sacrifice. Conversely, if you're a casual listener who just wants a bit more thump than the factory speakers provide, this might be overkill. The same effect could be achieved with a single 8-inch sealed sub and a smaller amp for a fraction of the cost and space. Also, if you're planning to keep your car's interior as clean and uncluttered as possible, the ported box's need for a vent cutout could be a hassle. Finally, if you're on a tight budget, the bundle's price reflects the JBL branding and the high-power components, so you'll need to be comfortable spending a couple of $100s on a system that, while powerful, isn't essential for everyday driving. One hidden trade-off that isn't often shouted about in the spec sheet is the heat management. The amp's efficient design means it stays relatively cool, but the drivers themselves can get warm during prolonged high-volume sessions. In a hot summer, that extra heat can seep into the trunk, which may affect nearby items. Think cooler drinks or a laptop you left in the back. I've found that running a small ventilation fan or simply keeping the trunk door slightly open when you're blasting